explorer, politician, Premier of the state, almost Prime Minister, and a major force behind the Kalgoorle pipeline, the Indian Pacific Railway, and Fremantle Harbour. John Forrest was a towering figure in Western Australian history. John was born to Scottish parents, William Forrest and Margaret Guthrie, who immigrated to Australia in 1842 aboard the ship Trusty. The family migrated to Australia on the understanding that they would be working for Dr. John Ferguson. But Ferguson's farming venture near Australand was not a success, and he returned to medical work. Ferguson was later to establish the Horton Vineyard in the Swan Valley. The Forrests established first a wind-driven and then a water-driven mill at Picton River. William and Margaret's firstborn, a daughter, had died before they left for Australia, and their second child, William Jr., was born aboard ship. Next came James in 1845, John in 1847, Alexander in 1849, and then David, Robert, Matthew, George, and finally Augustus. Sadly, Augustus died by drowning, aged only 14 months. From humble beginnings at Picton near Bunbury, John Forrest was to rise to lofty heights, coming within 3 votes of becoming the first Prime Minister of Australia. John was born on the 22nd of August 1847, and although he had 8 brothers, John was to have no children of his own. His initial education was at a school in Bunbury, and he continued at Bishop Hales School in Perth between 1860 and 63. On finishing school, he was indentured to a land surveyor in Bunbury, Thomas Campbell Carey, in 1863. John, called Jack by his family, had great admiration for the earlier explorers and a great love for the outdoors. This was to serve him well in years to come. He was schooled well in the arts of survey and navigation. On finishing his apprenticeship, he became the first locally born land surveyor. He then went to work for the survey department. In 1869, an expedition was proposed to search for the explorer Leichhardt, who had gone missing in 1848. Forrest was appointed as second in command at the age of 21, but when the man chosen to lead the expedition, Dr. Ferdinand Müller, withdrew, Forrest was asked to be the leader. He led the expedition over 3,200 kilometres, but found no trace of Leichhardt. By 1874, Forrest had led 3 highly successful expeditions across Australia. The first in 1869 ended near the present site of Laverton. The second in 1870 backtracked Edward Ayres' footsteps from Western Australia along the south coast to Adelaide. The last in 1874 left Geraldton and crossed the arid centre to the Adelaide to Darwin telegraph line and then south to Adelaide. In all these expeditions, despite the hardships, Forrest never lost a man. His careful, methodical nature ensured that he took no unnecessary risks. He would always scout ahead for food and water, and never pushed too far ahead so that he could not retreat to the last place of refuge. Perhaps because of the lack of drama during his expeditions, his name does not seem to rate as highly as people like Burke and Wills or Leichhardt, who were in fact failures. Speaking at a dinner in honour of John's successful crossing of the continent from west to east, his father, William, made the following comment.
"Ye have heard a lot tonight about John Forrest and Alexander Forrest, but let me tell you clearly, that if it hadn't been for me and my old wife Margaret, there wouldn't have been any John Forrest nor Alexander either."
John went to England in 1875 and published the journal of his travels called Explorations in Australia. In February 1876, John Forrest was made Deputy Surveyor General. In the same year he also married Margaret Elvire Hammersley and continued surveying large tracts of the state until May 1880, when he became Acting Superintendent of Convicts for 15 months. During his time in that position, he reduced both floggings and the punishment of being kept in irons. In 1882, he was awarded the CMG, the Companion of the Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George. And in 1883, at the age of 35, he became the first native-born Western Australian to be appointed to the Executive Council. This was his first step into politics. Not everybody was exactly thrilled at this appointment, and the following appeared in the January 17th edition of the Inquirer. No doubt, many of our colonists will feel disappointed at hearing of the promotion of Mr. John Forrest. The colony must be going to the dogs, they will mutter, when we are not now thought worth having an English official sent to us. Also in 1883, Forrest organised the first large-scale survey of the Kimberley, and was part of the expedition for several months. By 1887, he had travelled to Canada, America and England, and returned to WA full of ideas on how to make things better. He pushed for a railway to Adelaide, for a port to be developed at Fremantle. He somewhat reluctantly supported federation and generally started on a path that led him to a full-time life in politics. At the age of 43, he became the state's first premier, with one of his first decisions being to employ the engineer Charles Yelverton O'Connor. Western Australia started off as a Crown colony, but in October 1890 it became a self-governing colony, until January 1901, when it joined the Commonwealth of Australia. Forrest took up the office of Premier in December 1890, when the population of the state was a mere 48,000 people. John was awarded a KCMG in May 1891, and he was the first native-born Western Australian to receive this honour. He worked on the expansion of Kings Park, and was the first president of the Kings Park Board. John Septimus Roe had been the inspiration for setting aside the park for public use some 60 years previously, and Forrest had worked under Roe as a surveyor at one time. Forrest was a reluctant federalist. He understood that Western Australia should join the Federation, but he wanted to ensure that the state did so on terms that would not disadvantage its citizens. In 1901, when the population of WA had expanded over 5 times to 294,000, he stood for election in the Commonwealth Government and became Postmaster General. He held this post for just 17 days before taking up an appointment as Defence Minister for the new federal government. He was also Premier for Western Australia at the same time, so he had to resign from that position. He did so on February the 13th, 1901. Forrest later became Minister for Home Affairs and Treasurer. For a short time, he was acting Prime Minister. In 1917, Forrest's dream of a trans-Australian railway had finally been achieved. The project had taken 5 years to complete, and Forrest was aboard the first train to make the crossing. In 1918, John Forrest was informed that he was to be raised to the British peerage as first Baron Forrest of Bunbury. He died before letters patent were signed, so never officially became Lord Forrest while he was still alive. He was the first Australian to be given such an honour. Later the same year, Forrest was most unwell and boarded the troop ship Marathon en route to England to seek medical treatment. He was advised by his doctor not to go, but the pragmatic explorer and statesman simply said, "I have faced death before, and I will face it now. What does it matter if I die at sea?" He did die at sea on the 3rd of September, not long after his 71st birthday. His body was returned to Perth for burial. It seems somehow fitting that this great explorer was to pass away on his final voyage, and not in some obscure hospital bed. Today, when we see the Indian Pacific train, drink fresh water at any of the towns leading to the goldfields, or simply visit Fremantle Harbour, we should spare a thought for the man who dreamed of all these things and then set about making them reality. We owe John Forrest a great deal. On a final humorous note, the man who had successfully led several expeditions across the barren wastes of Australia had the bad luck to lose his way in Kings Park while working out a route for the second road. His party finally emerged near nightfall on the wrong side of the park.